Good evening and welcome to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator of this podcast, and what you are about to hear is a short teaser for the latest bonus episode. As you may or may not know, Dead Sleep is 100% ad-free and listener-supported. That means it really does rely on you, the listener, to succeed. If you would like to ensure the success of this podcast and enjoy a subscriber-only bonus episode each month, please feel free to subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. Just a few dollars a month really does make a difference in covering the essential production costs in making this podcast. Thank you for supporting my work, and I hope my work supports you. You can enjoy a free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thank you. And now, on to the teaser of the latest bonus episode. Good evening. This is the bonus episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime for November 2025. I'm Nancy Miller, and this is the follow-up. That's the second and final installment of a 2-episode series devoted to the sudden and mysterious death of a 27-year-old named Scott Johnson. Scott's older brother Steve would spend more than 30 years on his quest for justice. But before he can get justice, he has to find out the truth. What really happened December of 1988. Was it suicide, as the police said? Or was it something more sinister, as Steve believed? Now, again, this is part 2, so if you want the full story, please listen to the previous episode, A Mystery at Manly Cove. And before we begin, I wanted to be sure to note the two most crucial and sometimes contradictory sources in this episode. The first is the recently published memoir by Scott's brother, that's Steven Johnson. And the second is a deeply reported feature that appeared in an issue of The New Yorker back in October of 2025. But as always, this is my twist on things with additional details and detours to fatigue our busy minds, especially during these hectic weeks that are not just peak travel, they're also for many peak insomnia. It's this time of year. For those of us who have lost people that we loved, that we think of them, we remember them, we sometimes yearn for them. Sometimes those emotions can take you by surprise. Because for many, grief, it comes in waves. An ebb and flow. A tide of emotions that rush in, take over, and then retreat again and again. Over time, those waves, we're told that they get smaller and more gentle. The rhythm of that tide more predictable. And an awareness, if you're lucky, a sense that the person that you lost is somewhere at peace. But for Steve Johnson, his grief, it didn't come in waves. His was like a never-ending free fall. A tumble into a dark void of which he knew no escape. Back in December of 1988, his brother Scott's death, a tragic fall from a remote cliff with a drop of roughly 14 stories. The actual event, it was a matter of seconds. But Steve, he played it over and over again in his mind, every single day. And of course, Steve already knew the ending. His brother's body found on a bed of rocks along the water of the Tasman Sea along a beach just outside of Sydney, Australia, known as Manly Cove. But it was everything before that. How he got there, who he was with, what happened. A mystery that begins with a muddled timeline. The timeline between when his brother was last heard from, a 10 o'clock phone call on a Thursday, until his body was found early Saturday morning by 3 amateur fishermen. Based on the evidence that he knew, which wasn't much, there were a number of scenarios, and yet not one that really fit. By 2005, it'd been 16 years, and Steve was quite sure he'd thought of them all. There was the official version, what you might call the clueless Keystone Cop version. That is the version police said happened within 24 hours of what was, by any measure, a lackluster investigation. The main cop was a rookie, fresh out of the police academy, and he didn't think to treat the area where Scott supposedly jumped as a crime scene. So the official story was his brother Scott, plagued by some type of guilt or shame for his sexuality. Back when it happened in 1988, the cop said to Steve that they'd seen it before, this type of person and their alternative lifestyle. So much so that a phrase the cop used would stay with Steve for years. The cop said Scott likely jumped because he was gay, and that is, quote, what they do. And even though he was apparently in a happy relationship with a slightly older man named Michael, and even though he learned that Steve, his brother, had just had a daughter, which would have made him an uncle for the first time, and even though he had just celebrated his 27th birthday, right before his death, the police maintained Scott's final hours went something like this. Scott bought a one-way bus ticket, then took a ferry, then, once at Manly Beach, clambered his way up a high cliff top. And then once he got to the top, he took off all of his clothes, folded them into a neat pile, placed his other items on that pile, including his watch, a felt-tip pen, his student ID, and without a word to anyone, Scott just decided to take a running leap and drop out of the lives of everyone he knew forever. When Scott died at 27, Steve, he was only 29. And over the years, he had a chance to think that maybe there was a side of Scott he didn't know. And he was even willing to believe that maybe in some moment of desperation, Scott had taken his own life, except for 2 implausible details. Detail number 1. Scott took off his clothes before he allegedly jumped. Over the years, Steve asked all kinds of experts, including an ex-detective based in the U.S., how common it was for someone to strip down naked before they plunged to their deaths. And the answer to those he asked was never. No one did that. At least no one that this veteran detective had ever heard of in his decades on the force. And detail number 2. Even if he was willing to believe that Scott, being a free spirit and shedding his earthly life and belongings to bid his final adieu, Steve wouldn't ever believe that Scott would be so cruel as to leave Steve and not say goodbye. Steve knew Scott would have called He would have left a message. They'd found a pen. He would have left a note, even at the last minute. Scott was a gentle, kind, loving man. He would never have let Steve have to endure this pain. Not after everything they'd been through together. So, over the past decade or so, once he took suicide off of the table, he homed in on two other possible scenarios. And one of those options was something called death by misadventure. We don't hear that term much in the US. It's more common in Australia and the UK. But death by misadventure is a legal term determined by a coroner. When a death arises from some deliberate human act which unexpectedly and unintentionally goes wrong. A noteworthy example, Amy Winehouse. When the singer was found without a pulse in her Camden apartment in London in July of 2011, it was eventually determined to be a death by misadventure. After a toxicology report revealed Amy Winehouse had consumed a significant amount of alcohol after a long period of sobriety, and that alcohol proved to be more or less a shock to her system, which led to her death. In this ruling, death by misadventure was important for Amy Winehouse's family and her fans and her legacy, because her behavior, while ill-advised and risky, it was an accident. It was not an intentional suicide. This mattered in the same way to Steve. In this death by misadventure scenario, Steve imagined Scott going to this part of the woods, which was rumored to be a hidden hotspot for gay men to enjoy anonymous sexual encounters, and Scott went there to have a little afternoon tryst and somehow fell over. And the man he was with never reported the incident, maybe out of fear of being outed, which for many gay men back in the late 1980s, it still had the potential to destroy someone's life and career. But the scenario was far-fetched. No one had come forward, and there was no evidence that proved this. So that left option 3. And Steve doesn't spell it out exactly like this in his memoir. But reading between the lines, the scenario is what you might call the jealous boyfriend theory, where Steve suspected Scott's longtime live-in partner, Michael, of being involved somehow with his brother's death. The scenario he seemed to suggest was this. Scott and Michael were having relationship problems. Scott had gone to that cruising spot on the cliff before. Michael, suspicious, had found out about it and decided to follow him that day. And it was Michael who, in a jealous rage, pushed a naked Scott off of that cliff. Then he tried to cover it up by agreeing with the police that Scott likely took his own life because it was actually Steve who was in part responsible for Scott taking his own life. That it was Steve and his family who'd rejected Scott. In fact, Michael said he witnessed it himself when he visited the family. And this is the part that made Steve most furious. And that Scott looked up to Steve so much that it was actually Scott's fear of his older brother's disapproval, along with Scott's tragic, impoverished upbringing, that ultimately led him to do what he did. And in this darkest scenario, Michael believed he'd gotten away with it. But he'd overlooked one crucial detail, a clue only those who really knew Scott would see. Those neatly folded clothes that police said they found when they arrived on that cliff top. Scott was notoriously messy. He left his clothes strewn everywhere. And the likelihood that Scott would meticulously fold his clothes before killing himself. No way. Meanwhile, Steve had heard countless times from Scott how Michael was so persnickety. And wouldn't it be just like a fastidious little fuss budget? After he'd pushed Scott off the cliff, to not be able to walk away without meticulously folding those clothes, not realizing it would be the clue that would give him away. Of course, that was some fantastical Columbo version of events. Steve's suspicions about Scott's ex, Michael, grew so strong that back in 1988, when Steve came to Australia after he heard the news to attend the funeral, Steve low-key accused Michael of murder, and the two men hadn't spoken since. Over the years, Steve would recognize he was probably being paranoid back then. And the police were clear that Michael's alibi was checked and he was out of town for work in a whole other part of Australia and nowhere near those cliffs. But Steve still harbored a resentment that Michael had not only accepted Scott's suicide, but helped police confirm their theory, because Michael had told police that Scott had had serious suicidal ideation years earlier. This was all news to Steve about his little brother. But with the police, it was decided. Between Michael and the authorities, this led to a maddening final determination in the Australian court that in the absence of any other evidence, there was no doubt Scott did indeed jump from the cliff, and the matter was considered fully and properly investigated and closed. And despite Steve's efforts, including heated, fury-filled letters that he sent to Australian authorities, there was nothing he was able to do to change that cause of death from suicide to something else. So, from the late 1980s to the 90s to the mid-2000s, Steve dedicated his energy to moving ahead with the software company he and Scott had talked about. And he often channeled his brother's calm and methodical thinking to balance out Steve's impulsive and aggressive way of going about things. When Steve would encounter a problem that seemed too complicated, he remembered what Scott would always say: simplify, revise, and try again. And by 2005, Steve had everything he'd dreamed of. He was a multimillionaire with 3 great kids and a loving wife. He could buy anything he wanted, except the truth about what happened. And then in February of 2005, as Steve padded through the kitchen of his family's charming home on a leafy street near Harvard Square, he clutched a stack of mail in his hand and absently went through it until he noticed a plain manila envelope with Michael's name and information on the return address, which Steve was stunned to notice was right here in this part of Boston. Steve couldn't believe it. He and Michael, it turned out, only lived a few minutes from one another. Steve remembered, back in 1988, that Michael and Scott were planning to move to Boston around the time of Scott's death. It was hard not to imagine what could have been. And now Michael had moved on, and it seemed like he was living the life that he and Scott should have had, but obviously didn't. In the split second it took for Steve to open the envelope, he might have wondered if Michael had penned some long and agonizing confession. But inside the envelope, there was just a single sentence on a piece of paper. The note read, "Thought you would be interested in the enclosed." Steve pulled from the envelope a few sheets of paper, a series of Australian news articles that Michael must have printed out on his computer. "Thought you would be interested." Steve scanned the articles, and he saw 3 names: John Russell, Ross Warren, Gilles Martigny. 3 men, 2 Australian, 1 French. 3 men whose deaths had been ruled a possible suicide or death by misadventure at the base of some cliffs around the same time as Scott. These news articles said there was evidence these deaths were now believed to be murders. And it seemed, with these clippings, Michael now believed what Steve had suspected all along: that Scott hadn't killed himself. His life had been taken. He'd been murdered. Though this was a scenario Steve never envisioned. That not only had Scott been murdered, he was just one in a killing spree. But who had killed these men, and why? Steve noticed there was one more thing in the envelope: Michael's business card with his phone number on it. Steve interpreted that to mean that Michael wanted him to call, which he did. The 2 men arranged to meet. 2 enemies now brought together in a quest to find out what really happened to the man they both loved. And of course, along with that, who really did it? Thank you for listening to this brief sample of the latest bonus episode of Dead Sleep. Once again, if you'd like to hear the entire episode, you can subscribe via Spotify, Patreon, and Apple Podcasts. You can get a free month on Apple Podcasts and a free 7-day trial on Patreon. Thanks again for listening.